All right, hello everybody. My name is Travis Legleiter. I'm an extension professor at the University of Kentucky, based in Princeton, Kentucky. And today, what I want to do is talk a little bit about Johnson grass. And so, I am terming Johnson grass as a persistent and continuous challenge. So, as we get into this, Johnson grass, or really working with any weed that's out there, or talking about a weed, we really need to talk about identifying it before we really get into the control aspect. We often kind of assume that the audience knows how to identify all the weeds, and sometimes I think that's a fair assumption, but sometimes I think that's a little unfair too. So let's go over a little bit of ID of Johnson grass. If you see over here on this side, you can see in this picture kind of what we normally are identifying Johnson grass, or what makes it stand out. It's usually a big clump of grass, right? Big wide leaves up to and sometimes over an inch wide, fairly tall. It's usually as tall as the crop or taller than the crop that it's in, and usually has a very distinct white mid vein. So you can already see one right there in that big plant from quite a ways away, but you can also see it here on this young plant, right? That distinct mid vein, especially right here, that distinct mid white mid vein usually distinguishes Johnson grass, and typically, it is the largest grass of all the grass species when it's growing together with other grasses out there. And we'll talk a little bit about why that is here in a little bit. But it's not to say that there's not other grasses out there that also have big, large, wide leaves and thick, prominent white mid veins, right? There's other grasses that have that. And so with those, you can see we always need to do more than just looking at that. So, another distinguishing feature of Johnson grass that will distinguish it from some other grass species that look similar to is looking at the ligule. So, you can see there in the red circle, you can see the ligule. And so, the ligule is essentially that little piece of material. So this is the main stem of the Johnson grass, and it continues on down behind this leaf. But there's the leaf. So the ligule occurs where the leaf attaches to that main stem. So you can see here in this picture, I'm folding that leaf back to expose that ligule. And so, and it depends on your eyesight, but a lot of us need a little hand lens or magnifying glass to really get a good look at that ligule. It's not that you can't see the ligule without a magnifying glass. You can usually see it, but to see the characteristics of it, you usually need a little magnifying glass. But if you get a magnifying glass on all grasses, you'll see that there's either no ligule, a membranous ligule, or a hairy ligule. And so in this case with Johnson grass, it is membranous. So when I say membranous, it is like a membrane or a piece of tissue. Sometimes people even call it like a piece of tape, like a piece of clear tape. On Johnson grass, it's a pretty thick ligule, so it's not necessarily clear, but it's more translucent than what the rest of the leaf is. And so it is not a hairy ligule. So a hairy ligule is pretty self-explanatory. Is hairs, right? But with Johnson grass, it is a membranous ligule. The other thing to point out about Johnson grass that distinguishes it from several other weed species or other grass species out there is there's no hair on this plant. Whether it's on the top of the leaf, at the bottom of the leaf, on the stems, there's no surface that contains hair on Johnson grass. So those are two very distinguishing features that we can look for to help us identify Johnson grass, in addition to, that large growth and that thick white midvein. Another thing that we can look for that really helps us distinguish Johnson grass from many other grassy weed species is the fact that it's a perennial and the fact that it has rhizomes. So, rhizomes are an underground vegetative structure that helps spread the weed. So, most annuals only spread by uh, seed, right? But Johnson grass is a perennial, and it's a perennial that contains rhizomes. So you can see here in this picture, it blends into the background just a little bit, but right here you can see this is a rhizome that we dug up. Okay. So on this end here, you can see where there's a plant growing from that rhizome. That's a Johnson grass plant. And then right here, you see another one at this node. There is another Johnson grass plant emerging. Just on the other side there is a Johnson grass stem coming up from there. And as you go along, and if you look hard enough along all these little nodes of this rhizome, you will probably see where you're getting a bud or a new shoot to come out of that rhizome. And it ends right here, but it ends there because when I was digging it up, that's where I cut it off at. But this rhizome network went for quite a ways, and so this is one of the things that makes Johnson grass the persistent challenge that it is. Right, is that it not only spreads by seed but by these underground rhizomes. So if you allow these rhizomes to continue to grow and spread, they will continue to put up plants. And the thing about rhizomes is you know, a plant coming up from a rhizome is essentially an adult plant. So it comes out of the ground really quickly and it doesn't really have any startup time. It's just going. It's got all the energy it needs right there in that rhizome. And so it grows very rapidly. And that's often why we see Johnson grass growing so rapidly. Here's another picture. It's a little bit younger Johnson grass plant, but you can see there's still a rhizome there. So essentially getting back to the ID, if you are debating is this Johnson grass or not, you can dig it up, take your shovel and dig it up, and it'll become pretty obvious pretty quickly if it's has rhizomes or not, right? An annual grass without rhizomes, it's just going to be fibrous roots. It's still going to be a pain to dig up, but with Johnson grass, you'll hit that fleshy rhizome and you'll know it almost immediately when you find those rhizomes. So if you find rhizomes, you're going to know you're probably dealing with Johnson grass, right? Now, just because you don't find rhizomes doesn't mean it's not Johnson grass, because Johnson grass does come up from seed. So you may happen to have just dug up a seedling, but oftentimes you should be able to see that seed on that plant. And I don't have a good picture of that, but Johnson grass seeds, they're more blackish and more of an oval elliptic shape. And I mentioned that because of this next slide. So some similar weeds that can often be confused with Johnson grass would be one like shattercane. Okay, so shattercane is basically a cousin to Johnson grass. Okay, there's both sorghum. So Johnson grass is sorghum halpinth, whereas shattercane is sorghum bicolor. Right. The differences here is shattercane is an annual, so it only reproduces by seed, so it lacks those rhizomes. Right. Shattercane typically has much wider leaves. They're much wider than what they are on Johnson grass. If you're familiar with sorghum, with grain sorghum, that's pretty much shattercane, right? So those much wider leaves is what we expect on shattercane. And then also, if you do dig up that plant, don't see a rhizome, but you do see a seed coat there, part of a seed that's still attached to that seedling plant, and it's more brown and round. Again, that's shattercane because the Johnson grass seed is going to be more elliptical or oval and have more of a black color. It may have some brown to it, but more of a black color. Okay. Another weed that we often see confused with Johnson grass is fall panicum. Okay. And I will just straight up admit it's happened to me. I said, wow, I think we have some Johnson grass out here, but you go to dig it up and there's no rhizomes, and you dig a little bit further or look at it a little bit closer, and you're going to find it's fall panicum, right? So the reason why we often confuse Johnson grass and fall panicum is because they both have that white distinguished midvein, right? They both have that, and that's often why we confuse the two of them. But fall panicum is an annual, so it lacks those rhizomes. Again, if you dig it up and it has rhizomes, you got Johnson grass. But if you dig it up and it doesn't have rhizomes, doesn't necessarily say it's not Johnson grass. But the biggest way we can distinguish Johnson grass and fall panicum is to look at that ligule. And that's why when it comes to grass ID, we know it's a pain to look at ligules, but that's why we always say look at the ligule. And on fall panicum, you're going to find a hairy ligule, whereas on Johnson grass, it's going to be that membranous ligule. And that's really the biggest thing we can help to distinguish those two. So to review really quickly with Johnson grass, the white prominent midvein, it's got a membranous ligule and it has rhizomes. Those are kind of the things that we look for Johnson grass. So hopefully this video has helped you with that. But if you want more information on weed ID, we do have a Johnson Grass ID video at the University of Kentucky. If you go to the weekly Weed Watch, the University of Kentucky weekly Weed Watch on YouTube and look for Johnson Grass. We have a short little ID video there that we put out back in 2021, and it reviews a lot of the same steps, but also gives you a few more pictures, and it's a video where we're not just giving you still pictures, but actually doing some video, some idea there as well. So that's how we identify it, and that's usually the first step for control is knowing what you're trying to control. Once you know you have Johnson grass, we need to understand it a little bit more, right? I consider Johnson grass to be a bit of a rule breaker, a bit of a troublemaker, right? So, and I'll get into why I kind of say that. Historically, it's been a problem in the southern United States, but it's not to say that it's not moving north or individuals who are further north than even Kentucky shouldn't be expecting to deal with this maybe more often as we go further along and we start seeing some of these warmer temperatures, right? So the reason I say it's a bit of a rule breaker is, like we talked about, it's a perennial weed. Now, typically, when we think about our crops and our cropping systems and what weeds are going to be in them, we typically say, okay, what is our crop or what life cycle is our crop? So we usually say if we're in a perennial cropping system, typically we expect to mostly deal with perennial weeds because in a perennial cropping system, we're treating that system that's ideal for a perennial plant. And so that's why perennial weeds excel in those systems versus an annual system, so like corn or soybean, like a summer annual system, we typically expect to deal mostly with summer annual weeds, right? That's typically what we think of is we're going to deal with summer annual weeds, but we deal with Johnson grass in perennial systems and annual systems. Basically, it has no problem growing anywhere. It doesn't care what system it's in. It doesn't care what the other crop is. It can excel in that system, and that's why we say it's extremely plastic. We're not saying it's a piece of plastic. What we're saying is it's flexible, right? It doesn't care what the environment is. It can grow in that environment and excel in that environment or excel in that cropping system. And that's why I say it's a little bit of a troublemaker and a little bit of a rule breaker because, again, in our annual cropping system, we expect to deal with annual weeds, but we often deal with Johnson grass as well, and it's becoming more of a problem, and that's why I call it a continuous and persistent problem. So these are some of the reasons why we often struggle with Johnson grass as much as we do. It's just because it really kind of checks a lot of the boxes for what I would call a good weed, right? A weed that really checks all those boxes that would make it a weed. So, as we get into that and kind of think about, I talked about it's a little bit of a rule breaker, and maybe we should start expecting, not necessarily to see it only in the southern United States, but maybe dealing with it. It's not to say that if you're in the northern U.S., you haven't ever dealt with Johnson grass before, but Johnson grass, as you go further north, tends to be more of a annual because often it can't serve those rhizomes don't survive the winter, right? But that trend may be changing. We don't know yet. There's several researchers looking at this, but that trend may be changing, right? And part of that is, we're having warmer winters, and that might be contributing. So one thing that this past year, so in 2024, at least in Kentucky, the one thing we witnessed is it seemed like we had a lot of Johnson grass in May and June. It seemed to be the dominant weed in most of our no-till corn and soybean systems. So again, even though those are annual systems, because there's no tillage, that's why Johnson grass does so well in those systems because it doesn't get that disturbance. But even with some tillage and disturbance, Johnson grass is still pretty. It's fine. It deals with that as well. But in a no-till system, it does really well. But this year, in the spring and early summer, it seemed like, man, Johnson grass was just so prominent in every single field. And so when we look kind of back at our winter, it kind of made sense, right? So, you know what? Here in the map, these are the rankings out of 129 years, the rankings for the temperature, average temperature across the United States from November to April. So a little bit longer than the winter, but, going from late fall into early spring, you can see, Kentucky, we're the 125th warmest, going north. You have the 128th warmest in multiple states, 126th warmest. So it's just to say we had a pretty warm winter, right? It was pretty warm. And again, for Johnson grass, if you have a warmer temperatures or warmer weather, you give those rhizomes more of a chance to continue to survive over the winter, right? The other thing that I think happened, at least for us in here in Kentucky, and I think this again may be a trend we're starting to see, is every year it seems like we get into the field earlier and earlier every year. And so for our producers, that can mean good things, right? We've learned that with soybeans, we can get a yield bump if we get those things in the ground earlier in the year than what we traditionally did, right? Uh, so we're pushing that window. We're getting into the fields earlier, right? And we're doing that because we're having these warmer springs, right? And you can see that here. Here's your February temperatures, mean temperature. Here's your March temperatures, and here's your April temperatures, right? And so they're all, we're pretty warm for those months, not unreasonably warm, but warmer than what we'd normally think we would be. And the other thing that's happened is, and the thing that's kind of the inverse is we were fairly dry. We were almost abnormally dry in March in Kentucky, and then not dry but not wet in April. And what this did for us is it allowed our farmers to get out into the fields again in a no-till field and burn it off in March or April. And when they did that, uh, essentially what you did is you got rid of all the winter annuals. Your soil is already a little bit warmer than it usually is because of that warm winter and early spring. And so those Johnson grass rhizomes that have been sitting under that soil all winter, it is the perfect condition and they come out of the ground. And again, like I talked about, when that plant comes out of that rhizome, it's basically an adult. It's not a seedling. So it grows very quickly. And compared to all the summer annuals that are also coming up, it's out of the ground and growing much more quickly than any of those. And that's why it became the predominant weed for us in the early spring and or in spring and early summer this year. And I think that's something we can, at least in Kentucky, but I think even as you move further north, we should start seeing or expecting with Johnson grass as we see our winters get warmer, our springs get earlier. I think we're going to be dealing with more Johnson grass, right? So here's the good news, we're still controlling it, right? We're controlling John's grass. So, I'm going to stick to corn and soybeans here. I know it's a problem in our pasture systems as well, but just for time today, we're going to talk about corn and soybean, right? Um, so we still rely heavily on glyphosate for Johnson grass control, right? And it's still working for most of us. I know there's some glyphosate resistant populations out there, but glyphosate's still one of the best products we have. Oftentimes in our soybean acres, it's also seen a group one, so something like clethodim or quizalofop are probably the two most popular. So that'd be something like Select and Assure. There's others as well, but often these are in the tank late in the growing season to help control volunteer corn that can't be controlled with glyphosate. And so while that group one usually isn't targeting Johnson grass, it's actually targeting volunteer corn. Our Johnson grass is seeing that group one as well and often helping out with that Johnson grass as well. In our corn acres, we now have enlist corn that allows us to spray quizalofop, so it's another option in corn. We also have products like Nixolfron and Remsulfuron, the A-list products that we've had for years and decades, right? And they still, for the most part, do a pretty good job on Johnson grass, but they're better on seedling Johnson grass. When it comes to rhizome Johnson grass, they're marginal and they're just not as good as glyphosate is, right? Um, but we're still doing a pretty good job. If we get one or two post passes on a field, we could still do a really good job with Johnson grass. That's the good news, but that's kind of a short-term outlook. And with Johnson grass, I think we have to quit thinking about it in the short term. And that's why I said it's a persistent and continuous weed. But I also think we have to be persistent and continuous in our control tactics as well. So it's a double-sided thing that I named this is not only is the weed persistent and continuous, if we want to truly control this in the long term, we also have to be persistent and continuous. And so what I just talked about is I said, hey, we're controlling it, right? We still have products that control it, but the problem is we're treating it as an annual, right? We're basically, those products are going out primarily to control the annual weeds that are in our annual crops. And we just happen to also take care of that Johnson grass at the same time. But that's not really the right approach for Johnson grass because it's a perennial. We need to be treating it like a perennial. And so the goal here is with Johnson grass is the reason it's persistent and continuous is because of those rhizomes. Okay. Again, that's those underground structures that are spreading underground, growing underground, laterally, and putting up new plants and new shoots. The other thing that those rhizomes do is they store energy. You got to think of those rhizomes as batteries, right? Those are the batteries for the plant. And so if you deplete that battery, you're going to kill that plant. So think of it as a battery. And just by spraying it once or twice a season, yes, you do kill all of this top growth, but you're not really doing a whole lot to the rhizomes. You might set them back a little bit, but it's probably going to recharge pretty quickly. And so that's why we have to be persistent and continuous because if we continually hit that plant or continually knock it back, I'm not saying with herbicides, but with different methods, we can wear out that rhizome or that battery. And that's the key, wearing down that battery. Uh, letting those rhizomes just completely deplete themselves. And that is the key to having long-term control of Johnson grass, right? So another thing that we should really think about or talk about when we're talking about, we treat Johnson grass as a system as an annual when it's truly a perennial is the fact that we often use residual herbicides or pre-emergence herbicides within our corn and soybean acres. Whereas with Johnson grass, those residuals really aren't doing anything for rhizome Johnson grass. Rhizome Johnson grass is not coming up from a seed, and residual herbicides only control weeds that are coming up from seed. And so that is oftentimes, again, why we need to think about treating Johnson grass more as a perennial and think about the fact that those residuals, while we still need them for all of those annual weeds, it's not really doing a lot for that Johnson grass. And so that's, again, another thing we have to think about when we're thinking about Johnson grass is the fact that it's really only the post herbicides that are helping us. And that's why we use those ones that we just talked about. And so, if we think about this, and the other thing that we're doing with Johnson grass often is we really have to reverse our thinking with perennials. So in corn and soybean, just for example, talking about two annuals that we struggle with all the time, right? Water hemp and Palmer. They're annuals. And the thing we always hammer on and talk about is you got to hit them when they're small. You have to spray them when they're small. We have to reverse our thinking on Johnson grass, and it defies logic. A lot of times people are just like, "What are you talking about?" And the best time, if we're going to use glyphosate, truly, the best time is not to spray it when it's here, but when it's here. Okay. Glyphosate, and I know that just goes against everything we talk about with all of our annual weeds. We would never spray an annual weed when it's that big. But with Johnson grass, glyphosate is more effective if we apply it in the boot stage. So the boot stage is basically you don't see any seed heads yet, but you can see some of those flag leaves, and there is a seed head right here getting ready to emerge. And so why is that effective? It defies logic, right? Because we don't think about that with annuals. But the reason why that's effective is that glyphosate will kill all of this top growth. But the other thing that you've done is the entire season up to this point in time, this plant has been taking all of the energy from its rhizomes to produce all this leaf material and to produce those seed heads. It's putting everything into itself. It's depleting its rhizomes. So if you spray it and kill all that top growth, it has to restart from rhizomes that have been depleted. Now, they're not completely depleted at that time. They can still, don't worry, you haven't killed it. It's still going to regrow, but it's much weaker at that point in time. And so, you've depleted that battery that much and you're making it restart that from that depleted battery. And if you continually do that, eventually you get that battery down to zero if we do that time and time again. So that's the reason we talk about doing that. The problem in our annual crops is and I get it. Nobody's going to let a plant get this big in their cornfield, right? Because that's competing with your corn. But if we're able to, this is the time. This is the best time to control Johnson grass. So maybe think about that if it's Johnson grass on the edge of the field, right? It's not necessarily competing with your corn or your soybean crop, but it's contributing to the rhizome network and the seeds. So letting that get a little bit bigger and then hitting it, spot spraying with glyphosate if you can. So those are some things to think about. The other thing that I think we all should start thinking about a little bit more, especially if you're in the mid South where I'm at, is should we to stay persistent and continuous another time with perennials that are growing from rhizomes that we really can capture or kind of find a little bit of a weakness? Is to think about spraying it in the fall. Again, we treat this weed as if it's an annual and we only spray it in the summertime when our crop's out there. But the fact is, uh, what Johnson grass does is it grows all summer, it puts on its seed heads, it distributes its seed, and then it starts after it puts out its seed head, right? All that leaf material is now photosynthesizing, and now it's putting everything back into the rhizomes, especially as we get into the fall, because it's getting ready for winter. And to get ready for winter, what is it doing? It's pushing everything, all of its food, all of its energy that is producing from photosynthesis from all those massive leaves, it's pushing down into those rhizomes, right? And so if we spray it in the fall with a product like glyphosate that is systemic, not only are you getting all of that energy pushed down, you push the glyphosate down to those rhizomes as well, and we can really knock back those rhizomes. I'm not saying one fall application is going to solve all your problems, but again, you've really done a lot of damage to those rhizomes or that battery, and you do that several years, and we're hitting it multiple times in the summertime, and we're being persistent, we're being continuous over multiple years. I'm not saying we can eradicate Johnson grass, but you can really get a handle on it in your field. And for depleting those rhizome networks, even if you have just a couple of plants out there that come up from rhizomes, right? Uh, but maybe that rhizome network's not just is not as big, and those plants are probably relying more on seedling growth than they are rhizome growth. And we can control seedling Johnson grass. Again, I said we have multiple products that control seedling Johnson grass out there. And so that's the goal. And with Johnson grass again, especially as we get warmer winters, earlier springs, Johnson grass is going to become more persistent and continuous in our systems. And so I think that's why we need to start thinking about it and quit treating it as an annual, start treating it as a perennial, and be persistent and continuous ourselves in controlling this weed. So that's a fairly quick overview there of Johnson grass and thinking about, identifying it, thinking about its biology, how it grows, why it's such a problem, why we think it's going to continue to be a problem, as well as, some thoughts and ideas of how we can control it or be better managers of this. So, with that, I appreciate your guys' time. You can follow me on X. You can also, again, I mentioned those weed ID videos. There's several of those weekly weed watch videos on our UK YouTube. So it's UK Weed Science. Weed Science is all one word. Also, we have our 2025 AGR6 at that link there. And also, I greatly appreciate CPN giving us this platform to allow us to continue to talk about pest management. But I'd also point you to controlling weeds isn't only herbicides, it's also adjuvants. And so we do have an adjuvant publication now on the Crop Protection Network, and I'd encourage you to go check that out. Gives you all the ins and outs of adjuvants, a topic that can oftentimes be confusing, and the hope is that we help simplify that a little bit. So check out that publication at CPN. You can see the link there for that. So thank you, and I appreciate your guys' time.